Good morning to everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's just wait for our police and then we can start the lesson. That's fine. I see also our police has joined us.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Are you already in lockdown?
Not yet.
Not yet. Now you can share sort of opinions with Asayag and see who's better off. I mean, at least Asayag can move about until a certain hour. He can move around Rome, but I don't know for how long this situation will last. I mean, we are all very uncertain. Apparently, this afternoon, this evening, President Macron is going to announce a new lockdown, heavy lockdown in France.
Mm-hmm.
How's things in Malta?
The bars are going to close tomorrow for a whole month. And we have to wear the masks everywhere, except in our private cars. But if we would be in a car with someone who does not share the same household, we have to wear the masks.
Okay, more or less like Italy. This is more or less like Italy. Bars and restaurants too. Also restaurants.
Not restaurants, only the bars.
Only bars. So you're better off than us. For us, it's also restaurants, which you understand.
And
you close a restaurant for Italians. It's sort of it's a tragedy. Sort
yes.
of. Okay. Let's resume. We were analyzing last week. We were analyzing the issues of state aid, and we were looking in particular sort of the relationship that there is between state aid and services of general economic interest. We were looking at Article 14 of the treaty saying, well, yes, competition is very important, but we must allow services of general interest to be, general economic interest to be rendered, even though they receive some kind of public remuneration, then we will look into the relationship between Article 106 and 107 of the treaty, which concern 106 substantially public enterprises or enterprises that have public service obligations, and 107 which concerns in a generic way state aid. Now this is a very complex issue, and as you can imagine, now what is absolutely at the most important level is that of state aid. I mean, the whole European economy is somehow based today on state aid to somehow try to overcome the present economic, social, and obviously sanitary crisis. So just to point out that in these, at least since March of 2020, Article 107 has substantially been put aside when it talks about natural disasters. Well, we have spoken, we have generally considered natural disasters as something that has to do with the territory, earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, and so on, or very severe drought, or very severe storms, but now we are seeing it under this notion of disasters. Obviously, this the pandemic falls under the notion of disasters. Just to point out that how we are adapting rules to changing circumstances. So we're setting up new rules, but also adapting old rules to what is coming in front of us. Now, let's look at the, okay, just let me, sorry, 1 second. If I manage to move this, trying to move the slides here. Okay, here we are. Now, I'll just go back a second just to show you Article 107, when in paragraph 2 it says the following shall be compatible with the internal market: aid to make good the damage caused by natural disasters or exceptional occurrences. Obviously, this is an exceptional occurrences. So all the state aid that now is poured by the single member states and by the European obviously falls under this principle of paragraph 2 of Article 107. Now let's move on to more specific aspects. So first of all, what do we mean by state aid? Now this is very important because we find this notion of state aid not only in the field of transport, but in any field we have this notion of state aid, which is clearly contrary from a theoretical point of view to the principles of competition. If one player on the market receives state aid and others do not receive it, obviously competition is altered. Now, what we find is that when we talk about aid, what do we mean by aid? And this notion is extremely wide. It broad view, a list of types of aids, including direct subsidies, tax exemptions, exemption from parafiscal charges. Parafiscal could be social security charges. That is a typical example of parafiscal. If you are in a certain enterprise, you will not pay social security, or you will pay a lower social security rate. And Social Security, as we know, in Europe is a very important aspect of any enterprise. You have a worker and you pay 100 to the worker, and then you pay around 50, if not more, as a Social Security. So the cost of a worker changes significantly in accordance to what these parafiscal charges are. Preferential interest rates, well, now it's not so much of a problem because money is given on a zero interest rate, but it is favorable loan guarantees. You ask for a loan and therefore there is a guarantee. Provision of land on special terms. You want to build something and the land is given to you for free or nearly. So all these elements, as you see, the notion of aid is extremely ample. What we are interested is that we look at aid as not only positive benefits, but also measures that mitigate the charges an undertaking would normally bear. Clearly, this is only if there is, this gives an advantage over its competitors. So we must first establish if there is a market, therefore it is a service of general economic interest, and therefore there's a market. Because if it is a service of general interest, clearly we say that these have been taken away from the market. When the state pours money on the armed forces or on the police or on education or on health services, it says, well, these are services of general interest. They are not on the market, so I put all the money I want on it. Just to point out, when we're looking instead of services or activities, economic activities, which are rendered in a competitive environment, we must see if this aid, whatever its form, distorts competition. Now, what is interesting is to note is that when it comes to state aid towards services, and in particular to for public service obligations, so an enterprise is entrusted with certain obligations which are obligations of public service, and it receives a compensation. This compensation must follow certain principles that have been set out by the European Court of Justice in this decision, this Altmark case. What is interesting to notice is that the Altmark case, which sets the principles for public service obligations in all sectors, telecommunications, energy, all kinds of services, is at its origin a transport case. We shall see the details now. So in the Altmark case, we find that public service obligations are the rules that you apply in public service obligations come from a case which was born from transport services. Just to show you the sort of the relationship that there is between transport services and other kinds of services. Now let's look at this Altmark case, which is a case of, if I'm correct, 2004. Just 1 second. So, what is this? A case, Altmark case is a case which was referred to the European Court of Justice. By now you're familiar with this notion of preliminary referral to the Court of Justice for the correct interpretation of the law. And there was a German region, a lender, entrusted a certain company, Altmark, the duty, the obligation to perform certain regional transport services. And the competitor of Altmark came up saying you shouldn't have given it to Altmark because Altmark did not have those financial requirements that for operating that certain service. Remember that to provide certain services, we've seen this in aviation. This is a terrestrial transport, local regional transport service, but even there you need to have a certain financial stability, financial resources. You must show that you have financial resources. According to the competitor of Altmark, that had been granted this public service did not have any longer these requirements, and said that the competitor said that the subsidies that were given to the compensation that was given to Altmark were against the European Union regulations on state aid. So the question was, if this compensation were a form of state aid, and if it were compatible or not compatible with the treaty of the European Union. So you see, it is a question of competitive transport services. So someone, a private company that wants to enter the market that says, hey, but yeah, there's a publicly owned company which is given public service obligations, but it is receiving state aid and therefore competition is distorted. So this is the issue. So you see again, competition and state aid. Now this decision is very important because it sets 4 principles that we shall see in detail and which we will apply in not only in any transport activity, whether to infrastructures or to the service itself, but the Altmark principles apply to any public compensation for any public service, whatever its nature. As I've mentioned, it could be postal services, telecommunication services, energy services. So these principles, you will find them. If you meet again issues of public service obligations and state aid, you will find them repeated in many other cases. Court of Justice in the Altmark decision said that for a state measure to be classifiable as state aid, it must be capable of being regarded as an advantage conferred on the recipient undertaking, which that undertaking would not have obtained under normal market conditions. So the first, you see, this is simply indication that there's a distortion of competition. There's not a level playing field because one player, in this case, the complaint is Altmark, receives an advantage as compared to its competitors. And therefore, normally the Altmark would not have received those advantages, those benefits under normal market conditions. And so there is no advantage where state financial, however, there's no advantage where for state financial measure must be regarded as compensation for the services provided by the recipient undertakings in order to discharge public service obligations. So is the compensation that is provided for public service obligations state aid or not? This is the core of the question which was put to the Court of Justice. The Court of Justice says they are not. Compensation for public service obligations are not state aid, which distorts competition, provided this compensation follows certain principal criteria, and we shall see these criteria. So there is no state aid where the public service obligations are clearly defined. So the need that these obligations are very clearly defined, substantially. Just imagine a regional transport service. You must establish exactly what kind of public service obligations, what kind of routes again must be covered, what is the schedule that must be covered, what is the kind of if it is a road transport, the kind of buses, or if it is a rail transport, what is the kind of trains that must provide that kind of service. So it can't be just simply, oh, but in this region, in this province, I'll grant you, I'll ask you to fulfill these public transport obligations and I'll repay you. No, they must be clearly defined. And clearly defined means that each aspect of the obligation must be clearly stated. Why is this? Also because we shall see that the problem is compensation is related to the services that are provided. If these services are not clearly specified, then also the compensation clearly cannot, it is not clear why this compensation is paid for. Second, the parameters used to calculate the compensation are established in an objective and transparent manner. That is, they must be established clearly. For example, how many kilometers are every day or every week or every month or every year are covered. That is, when you think of a transport, and we're talking this kind of this case of terrestrial transport, you think of what are the objective criteria. The number of kilometers. If the kilometers are 10, 50, 100, how many times a day? So you must indicate how many, what is the kilometers. Then you must indicate the amount of equipment you're using, how many trains, how many buses, how many carriages, how much is the personnel that you're going to use, what is the scheduling, is it going to be once a day, twice a day, one, so objective and obviously transparent in the sense that they must be made public. So this shows you that when we are granting compensation for public service obligations, these obligations must be clearly stated, also because if they're not clearly stated, you're not able to verify compliance, because what you want to do, as it is a public service, and this public service is rendered to the community, you want to be sure that that service is actually rendered. If it is not properly rendered, you see that there's an obligation. Just think of a normal contract. In a contract, the obligation of one party must be clearly stated. If it is not clearly stated, the other party can say, the obliged party can say, oh, but it's not clear what I have to do. Here it must be clear. So objective, and I've shown you mostly, we're talking of quantitative elements that are objective. Kilometers, number of equipment, number of how many times it is rendered, timetable. It could be objectively, it is different if it is rendered during the daytime or at night, for example. Then compensation for the public service merely covers cost. So the compensation is, you must establish, once you know what the public service obligations are, and these are clearly defined, and you have indicated them with some objective parameters, then the cost must be, the compensation must cover only the cost. And so how do you calculate the cost? Well, this is a typical activity that any company does, any company, whatever company, whether it is producing goods or it is providing services, he knows what its costs are. So if you are producing a car, you know what the cost of the car is. If you're producing a service, just imagine a transport service, you know very well what the cost is. Just think of very simple, a taxi service where there's one car, one driver, and that driver knows very well what his or her operating costs are, how much the car costs, its amortment, the petrol, the license, driving license, insurance, how much you use the cars, maintenance of the automobile, and so you can easily calculate what is the cost for the provision of a transport, so easily, depending, but you generally know what the cost is. If you are a business, you know what your costs are. So the compensation must cover only the cost plus a reasonable profit. What do we mean by reasonable profit? Well, generally, if we look at sort of European standards, generally say, well, 10, 15%. So let's imagine that the costs are 100. Well, we will say that the compensation, which is in accordance to Altmark, is 110, 115. So this is a very important aspect. And then we have this further element. Often, public service obligations, this happens very commonly in air transport, but also sometimes also in regional transport. These services are not provided directly, but through a public procurement procedure. In the sense, let's imagine, typical example, air transport from mainland France to Corsica, from mainland Italy to Sardinia. And so the ministry or the government or the local government does a public procurement procedure, says, I want to have air transport, passenger service from this route, let's imagine from Paris to one of the airports in Corsica, or from Milan to one of the airports in Sardinia, on a certain schedule, once a day, twice a day, with a certain capacity, with certain timetables and so on, every day of the week, on holidays and so on. And who is interested to offer this kind of service? So this is a typical public procurement procedure. So someone, one or more companies, air transport companies, come in, make an offer, and then one of these will be chosen. So this is the typical case. We find many cases in which the undertaking, which is must provide public service obligations, is chosen through a public procurement procedure. This procedure must allow the selection of the tenderer capable of providing those services at the least cost to the community, or compensation is determined on the basis of analysis of the cost of an average well-run undertaking in the sector concerned. So we must clearly this this procedure is set out, you must establish very clearly what are the criteria on which basis you will award this public service obligation to a certain undertaking. Remember, we've seen this in the past in one of the slides. Remember that when in transport, when a company undertaking is entrusted with a public service obligation, it is on an exclusive basis. Therefore, there is no competition. So what are you doing? You are removing a certain service, a certain route, Paris-Ajaccio, Milan Alghero, you're removing it from the market, you're giving it only to one company, and you're saying you must provide this service on the basis of public service obligations, which are very precisely defined, and this procedure, I will award it to the company that asks for, has a lower cost. That means that there is clearly connect this to the idea that the compensation must cover the cost, or one looks at cost, one predetermines the cost on the basis of what is a well-run undertaking. You look at air companies, you say a normal air company would provide this service at a certain cost. Well, this is the highest level. Let's say this is 100. Well, you must offer something less than 100 to provide this kind of service. So, but anyhow, the notion is that if there's a procedure, this procedure must follow certain rules in providing for establishing who is the winner of the procedure. These 4 criteria, 1, 2, 3, 4, are cumulative. That is, they must be all present. Clearly defined obligations, objective and transparent manner to calculate the compensation, clearly establishing what the compensation will be, covering cost and a reasonable profit, and finally the rules that must be followed when there is a public procurement procedure. So you see, they must be, all 4 of them must be present. If one of them is lacking, then this has to be the conferral of this activity to a certain undertaking must be notified to the Commission and might fall under the notion of state aid. It depends obviously on the case. One has to analyze what the case is, because maybe there's no, the Commission establishes, just think of sort of a route, an air route to a very distant island. It's very few passengers, but you must provide that service. Nobody is willing to do it throughout the last 20 years. Nobody's been willing to provide this, and you could give it on directly without a public procurement procedure. Why? Because it just makes it too long to have this procedure, and it's much easier just to award it. You want continuity in the provision of this transport service. So you send this, you notify this to the Commission. Commission says, well, but this is, remember the Article 107. Sorry, just let's go back to it. Promote the economic development of areas where the standard of living is abnormally low, or the development of certain economic activities or of certain economic areas. So just to point out that it could be simply you notify it to the Commission, and the Commission under Article 107, paragraph 3 says, okay, that's fine. I have no objections to this conferral of these public service obligations. So it isn't the Altmark is not saying that it's forbidden. It says simply, if you do not fulfill these 4 elements, criteria, then you must notify the award of a public service obligation to the Commission, and the Commission shall decide on general criteria used by Article 107, mostly paragraph 2 and paragraph 3. Then I think let's go back to the notion of state aid. Now, why are we interested in state